Will Ireland have a referendum on reunification as a result of Brexit, as guaranteed by the Good Friday Agreement? It should have happened already. Why hasn't it? You know, will they get it? I mean, Sinn Féin are jumping up and down for it. Sinn Féin won, you know, a great deal of support at the last Irish Republican election. They have strong support in the north. And yet again, British intelligence are operating behind the scenes to discredit them, and the Irish provisionals of the Protestant variety have now said they no longer adhere to the Good Friday Agreement. So, who's behind all that? What role have British intelligence been playing in stirring the pot to do everything it can to prevent Irish reunification and to tear up the Good Friday Agreement? To what extent was Brexit itself an anti-Irish unity move? The masterminds of Brexit, if that's the right word, I mean the master idiots of Brexit, to what extent did they feel that by keeping Europe out of British affairs, they'll be able to solidify and cement a relationship between Britain and Northern Ireland? I think some of them thought that. I think the unionist politicians in Belfast thought that. Were they right? No, I don't think so. I think they made a gross error of miscalculation. And I've been involved with this Irish peacemaking process for a long time. I'm partly Irish myself. I've been to Ireland many times. I know a lot of the academics involved in conflict research in Ireland, going right back to John Burton, who was one of the founders of the field. And I and my colleagues, we've been working tirelessly for 20 years and more to bring about peace in Ireland. I grew up when there was daily bombings and things going on in Belfast and elsewhere in Ireland. The Catholics and the Protestants really have a deep-seated animosity, and they both have their own narrative of truth. How do you therefore heal and bring peace in conflicts where both sides have such deep-seated animosity? Well, that's where the fact that we were all part of the one European Union was providing a sort of transpersonal healing platform whereby all their voices could be heard. You see, the European Union has many Protestant countries and many Catholic countries. It has German Protestants, it has Danish and Swedish and the ancient Protestant traditions, but also many Catholics as well. And they live happily together, and religious violence and so on is just a thing of the past here in Europe. And it was getting that way in Ireland. We got the Good Friday Agreement in the 90s. I was playing a role intellectually behind that with colleagues. And yet suddenly Brexit throws all that into uncertainty. Is that worth any possible gain that was got by Brexit? No, of course it's not. The cost-benefit analysis on Brexit is utterly dismal. The destabilisation it threatens for Ireland is in no way counterbalanced by any benefit it's brought to Ireland or the UK. On the contrary, it's just a complete dismal story from end to finish, in my opinion. And I believe the facts uphold that. How bad does it have to get to be before people realise the errors of what they did? We'll wait and see. That's another thing I don't know. I mean, I would have thought any intelligent, rational, educated person, or just anyone that's been through any kind of basic schooling or history of Britain would see by now that Brexit was a catastrophe and would have stopped associating with it. And that's what I hope for. Still, that sort of the penny will drop. It probably won't drop unless there is Scottish independence, unless and until, and Irish unification. I think the forces that created Brexit are that entrenched. Now, question mark, are they linked to the alleged forces that generated World War One? Is there a link between the financial capitalist elite forces that move billions around the world and park it in Cayman Islands and Jersey and the Isle of Man and the City of London and all that? Is there a link between those international capitalist forces and the forces that generated World War One and the forces that generated Brexit? Well, I don't know. I mean, I can't name names, I can't point the finger, but I think, like a scientist of history, which is what I am, if the gases are emerging in the tube and you can test for them, even though you can't see them, well, then it looks like that's the reaction that's been happening. History is a series of sort of chemical reactions as players and forces operate, and most of it is behind the scenes. I mean, Marx, for all his waywardness and his pedantry, I mean, he at least knew that, how complex history is, and that yes, it's a result of many forces, including international capital. What Marx didn't see at the time is the links of capitalism and militarism, and that's become utterly crystal clear since his day. I'm sure that had he lived through World War One and World War Two, he would have realised that, undoubtedly. So, yeah, I don't know if Ireland will achieve reunification, but I'd say it looks likely. And I have a very deep interest because I'm chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Britain and Ireland, and I've chaired meetings and written about it, and I'm an activist as well as an intellectual. I call myself an intellectuist, and so this is important stuff, and that's why I'm so against Brexit and the people behind it. What else don't I know? Gosh, where to begin? Well, here's a sort of change of gear, but I don't know if Enoch was actually a real person. I did a commentary on the 3 books of Enoch. Loved them. Spent a year or two working at the Castle of the Musings in Scotland, working on the detail, every line by line of the books of Enoch. What I do know for sure is they influenced Christ. Absolutely, without doubt. He had absolutely read 1 Enoch, which was brought back to Britain by a Scottish explorer in the 18th century from Ethiopia. It's in the Ethiopian Bible. Why isn't it in all the Bibles the Church of England puts out in every church? Again, I don't know. I mean, the trouble with churches is they get sort of stuck at some ancient crystallization. To go back to the history as a series of chemical reactions analogy, so is the history of religions. And the trouble is, religions crystallize out their particular theological window of views at a particular time, and it gets codified in a creed or something, or a 39 articles, and then it's very hard to get the thing to be fluid again, because to me spirituality is about the fluidity, it's about the Tao, it's about the flowing insights that come. And I think it was for Jesus too. I know it was. He absolutely saw, when he read the books of Enoch, what his mission was. That was his script for everything he then does as a wisdom teacher. I don't think it's the only thing. He didn't only read that. I think he was familiar with other sources, other wisdom traditions. But Enoch comes out of that proto-Kabbalistic tradition. So that's really definite. Listen to my commentary on the books of Enoch. But what I don't know, and there was a second and a third book, which it's possible Christ knew the second one. He wouldn't have known the third because that was later, that was 500s AD. And it's very much proto-Jewish Kabbalistic, probably from the Babylonian Jewish community. And in these 3 books, the sage Enoch ascends to the heaven worlds. He converses with the top angels running the universe. He sees God in the throne room, and he sees gods like administering angels. And they talk about the world. They talk about karma, what we would call karma, righteousness, good and evil. They talk about the origin of evil. They talk about the fall of man, to use a kind of Christian terminology. But that is discussed in the first book of Enoch in great detail. The origins of the diabolic, forces that are trying to upset mankind and throwing countervailing strategies to defeat us from our well-being and our created, happiness. Really, we're supposed to be happy and intelligent and wise, and yet here we are all suffering all the time. So Enoch, the book of Enoch, tries to struggle with the origin of that, and that's, I think, where Christ got some of his theology from. He was an Enochian Hellenistic Jew, effectively. Why is this never taught in parish churches? Why is this not something that, Archbishop of Canterbury gives sermons on? I don't know. I mean, it's as if there's a conspiracy against intelligence. The same forces that killed Christ, which I've christened Sophiophobia, the fear of wisdom, the same forces that killed Socrates and all the other great wisdom teachers of humanity, seem to be reoccurring in every generation. There's this sort of default ignorance that is deep in human nature. This was Calvin's point. This was John Knox's point. I mean, this idea of original sin. It was Augustine's point. I understand their formulations, but I think they need recrystallizing, because, like Matthew Fox, I think that behind original sin there's original blessing. There's a deeper level of beauty in the human being, in the soul. But some people have so forgotten that they've lost touch with it. And the Christ story was a way, what Christ hoped was, that by going through his passion, his enactment, his theatre, he would reawaken people back to their original divine spark. And it sort of works for some people, not for others. It's a language that's not accessible to most people nowadays. Meister Eckhart understood this and put that into his sermons, as Matthew Fox has done more recently. And, there are many great theologians that understand what I'm saying and are trying to explain that. But having said all of that, the importance of the Enochian literature is huge. It represents a possible reconciliation of Christian and Jewish and Muslim theologies. Because in Islam, Enoch is also revered. He's called Idris, and he's revered as one of the great sages of all humanity. Before Christ, before Moses, from ancient times. And Enoch was from very ancient times. He seems to have been Sumerian, a priest sage who had spiritual experiences of ascension, 2800 BC or something. But who was the original? This is the thing I don't know. I'd love to find out. I'd love we find a tomb in a Sumerian city and, it says, here, Enoch was here, and it's got all his scrolls. That'd be lovely. Or was it not just one person? Was it a composite? Was it a layering of different kinds of priests and priestesses who'd had different kinds of ascension experiences over centuries? And the news of that filtered through to the Hebrew people. And they eventually wrote it down, in among the circles that were writing the book of Genesis. At the same time, the first book of Enoch was being written, it's thought. The layerings that go into the book of Genesis are similar to the layerings that go into the first book of Enoch. And, this is really interesting stuff at the frontier of biblical studies. And when I did my commentary on it, I went into it in huge detail. Okay, so there's a load of stuff I don't know. And I think it's quite important, actually, that we find these things out. I'd rather spend money on doing this kind of research and getting scholars from Judaism, Christianity and Islam all working on this, and paganism, because Oh, the joke is Enoch was probably a pagan from Sumeria. You know, he was pre what we would call the differentiation into revealed religions. He was the source of that revelation, and he was closer to the shamanic journeyings that people do, the outer body journeyings that Kuliana wrote about, Eliada's disciple. So we all ought to have a bit more humility, you know, and research this stuff, and it involves studying things like out-of-body experiences, which I think are scientifically valid. You know, why isn't this taught? Why aren't every RE class in the country, you know, classroom got pictures of Enoch up as well as Muhammad and Abraham and Jesus? Yeah, I don't know, except the Sophia-phobia is very, very strong in people. Okay, another thing I don't know, and this is quite fun, also very similar, is I don't know why the Quran seems to fluctuate in what I call revelational intensity, vibration. It's a mathematical question that I've asked, and in my commentary on the Quran, which I've spent years on, I mean, I hope to finish it before I die, it's nearly finished, in detail commentary on the lines of every verse in the Quran. Some of the verses are absolutely unbelievably top-notch divine revelatory transmissions. Others seem to come from a slightly lesser ethical and spiritual grasp of reality. Now, how is that possible? When? Why? Was the Quran doctored with? Were some of these verses not from Muhammad? Did Muhammad have off days when some of his transmissions weren't quite up to scratch? Was it doctored with by the committee that put the Quran together in the present form? Do prophets, are they always like 99.900% on the top of their game, or do they sometimes get, distorted or fuzzy revelations coming through? And what is a revelation anyway? We now call it channeling in the modern world, but in those days the prophetic tradition talked about getting a message from God into the mind of the prophet, who then transmits it. Well, how does that work? What was going on there psychologically? If you'd have been a psychologist transported back, 1400 years, and interviewed Muhammad for field research and said, Muhammad, I want to ask you a few questions about the psychology of religion. Is that okay? Yeah, fine. Who are you? Well, I'm from the future. I'm a research assistant at the University of London. I'm researching the psychology of revelation, and we'd love to just know what's going on here. Oh, that's fine, Muhammad would say, and give some discussion. I mean, that would be really interesting, wouldn't it? And I'm sure my friend Dr. Zaki Badawi would have loved to organise research like that. That's what we were doing at the Muslim College when he was around. Unfortunately, he died. But he did receive a knighthood, bless him, before he died. He was a friend of Prince Charles, who I think is also interested in these kind of questions. So no, I don't know. And in my commentary on the Quran, I've been absolutely honest about this. Look, this verse is absolutely extraordinary, amazing, from the highest realm of spiritual insight. And then this verse seems to be off-centre ethically. What I've done in my commentary, therefore, to try and clear this up, is it's the first time anyone has ever done a commentary in chronological and historical order. The Quran is not in historical order. The version we have is a pastiche put together from different times of the chronology of the revelationary process. Now, I think that distorts what one would see if you saw the revelationary process unfolding. And that's why I put it back into chronological sequence. The fact is that in the early phase of Muhammad's life, when he was a young teacher, a sort of adult education spiritual teacher, like I was for many years in London, the quality of his revelations were very, very pure and profound, especially for someone that was only, orally educated and not qualified in any academic sense of the term. You know, he'd never visited, so far as we know, he'd never done his degrees, as it were, which were available in those days in the Byzantine Empire and in Persia. He'd picked up his spirituality from the desert culture and the merchant trading groups that he frequented, and he'd been involved in the Lakhmid culture, which was based in in southern Iraq, and there were mingling Manichaean, Zoroastrian, and Gnostic Christian, and Oriental Christian, and Jewish, and pagan Arab cultures. I mean, it was an amazing place in those days, the Lakhmid Empire, and he went and sat at the feet of these people, and that's what the Quran is. And that's where the Arabic alphabet was first developed, by the way. So, historians of ideas like me, we can sort of piece back the evidence trail. And that's why I've done my commentary in a chronological sequence. And it's the first time, which I think is ridiculous. It's 1400 years since Muhammad. Somebody should have done this a very long time ago. I think the thing is, we didn't have the tools. And too much blood has been spilt on this frontier between the Christian European world and the Islamic world. Instead of resolving this through fights and crusades, I'm saying let's scholars sit down from all parties and resolve this through the power of the pen, which is Muhammad's own saying is mightier than the sword. And so, I've written this fascinating research, I tell you, and there's still lots to discover, but the impact of those influences, the Manichaean, the Zoroastrian, the Gnostic, these are demonstrable within the text of the Quran, and therefore in the mind of Muhammad, who acted as the channel. And this has wonderful implications for peacemaking between Jews, Muslims, Christians, pagans, in the Middle East and worldwide. We have to make peace between these great traditions. They're all important. And we shouldn't minimise the importance of the pagan contribution. As a pagan academic scholar, I've always said, look, don't forget Plato and Orpheus and Pythagoras. These were great pagan thinkers, Aristotle. And Jews, Muslims, Christians all actually borrowed from and sat at their feet. After all, it was pagans who invented the alphabets, be they the Arabic, the Hebrew, or the Greek, or the European or British, or Latin. So anyway, there's a whole load of unknowns there, I've been friends with people that are descendants of Muhammad, some of my dearest friends, but I don't know. There's so many things I don't know, about the Quran's creation and its revelation and its download and its fluctuation of quality. And a lot of those questions I put into my commentary on the Quran. Okay, what's another thing I don't know? Well, I don't know when Palestine is finally going to get peace with Israel. And that's the front line, if you want, of the intellectual discourse that I'm deeply involved in as a philosopher and historian, deeply interested in these mysteries. But I'm only interested in them because I want to help the people now who are Muslims or are Jews or are Christians or are pagans or are Gnostics. I want us to live on this planet in peace so that we don't fight over who's got more truth than who. We all recognise our relative impoverishment and we share, therefore, I mean, if this pandemic hasn't taught us that, I don't know what it's taught us. It should have taught us to go beyond ego. And that violent, egotistical, Trumpist, Netanyahu type of never going to make peace with the Palestinians. And at least Trump, the one good thing he did, and I've said this before, was his attempt to make peace with the Palestinians. And I've written a commentary on his text. In his kind of bombastic naivety, he dared to try and put something on the table. And some of the content of the Trump peace plan is worth listening to. I think the State Department should revisit it, redo it, rebrand it, repackage it, and invite the Palestinians to come for the talks. Because Trump and his arrogance didn't even invite them. But there are good things, like a railway between Gaza and the West Bank, a port for Gaza, an airport for East Jerusalem and the Palestinian capital that would be there. Free movement for pilgrims of all kinds, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, etc. I hope also pagan. And the Templars, that was their thing. They wanted free movement and safe passage for pilgrims. Well, it's there in the Trump peace plan. So I think, two cheers for that. But what I don't know is how long we have to wait for it. I've been to Israel several times and Palestine. I've interviewed people. I set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East when I was there. I've interviewed people at high level on all sides of it. And yet, it's not happening. I feel like Hercules doing the 12 labours, and every time I sort of half finish one, another 12 appear. It's really annoying. So that's something I don't know, and really wish I did know on behalf of all my friends in Israel and Palestine. The Palestinians, their name comes from the Philistines, who were a great pagan culture, who were probably partly Mycenaean Greek. When will the Jewish and the Mycenaean Greek Philistines make peace? That's at the archetypal level of what underlies this conflict. When will the Muslims involved make peace? When will the Christians involved? There's so many unanswered questions, but I think peace comes when, in that moment of recognition, when you realise that the enemy, the other, the one you hate, is actually like you are dual projections from a common ultimate cosmic consciousness. And at that moment, you realise that the enmity of the dualism is foolish, it's a silly game, and that you can withdraw from it. You can introject, to use Jung's term. When will that happen? Yeah, I don't know, I mean, the trouble is that modern Zionist Netanyahu Israel has defined itself with its flag waving and its armed force and its notion of what loyalty is, and its tragic narrative of the Holocaust and so on, and the heroic narrative of fighting off the invading armies of the Arab surrounding nations and so on. It's created this sort of mono-narrative which gives no space to the other, apart from in a demonised fashion. That's very difficult to move forward in a peace direction. The Palestinians have their own narrative, which is the complete opposite, the complete obverse. And Mahmoud Abbas, who's the leader of the Palestinians, has, in his PhD thesis at the University of Moscow, he focused on the weird fact that many of the Jewish leaders in the early Zionist movement during the 1920s and 30s made deals with the fascist movement and the hard right, populist right, we call them, in Germany and Italy. And they modelled Israeli nationalism on this common populism that was there in Europe at the time. And the appeal of German and Italian nationalism was, let us rebuild our nations, let us have strength and courage and hope. And these Jewish intellectuals thought this was a good idea, and let's do the same with Israel. And so they were trying to build up Jewish presence in the Palestinian Mandate under the British. We were ruling it, and Hitler would send German officials, I think Himmler in person, to go and review the Zionist sort of youth camps and the sort of parades they used to do up and down. And that's just weird, isn't it? But it's a fact of history. That's what Mahmoud Abbas did his PhD on. That, yes, Jewish Zionist nationalism, flag-waving, blue and white stuff, was modelled partly on the populist movements of, Nazi and fascist Europe. Now that is something that, again, I don't know if that's taught I doubt it's very much taught in history lessons in Israel. It ought to be. It ought to be, these things ought to be studied both in Israel and Palestine to get to the truth. Not propagandistic, oh, that's anti-Semitism or something. No, it's, it's on the contrary, seeking truth is philo-Semitism. I'm a philo-Semite in that I seek truth for both Israel and Palestine, and for all the Semitic people of the Middle East, the wonderful Hamito-Egyptian culture, the people of Iraq and, Arabia. No, this is a philo-Semitic project, as is the Kabbalistic tradition and the, all these traditions. Why isn't it being done? Why don't we hear this kind of stuff on the BBC? Why didn't Jeremy Corbyn get up in Parliament when he was accused of anti-Semitism and say, get off it, I'm a socialist who believes in human values transcending division and religion. I'm a philo-Semite. Most of the early parts of the Labour Party were founded by radical left-wing Jews. We're a philo-Semitic party. Why didn't he do that? I don't know. I wrote to him and suggested it and never got an answer. So, very weird, isn't it? What else don't I know? God, the list goes on and on. Will I be able to stay in France even after this nonsense of Brexit? I don't know. Myriads of people were stuck in a limbo. I hope I've done all the right things to be able to stay. I want to stay in France. I love it here. My entire life's work is here at this Museum of the Muses. I don't want to be forced to become a refugee from my own home and my own culture. I'm a Francophile, Europhile, internationalist. But will I be allowed to stay? I don't know. If I'm not, well, where will I go? I don't know. I haven't got a clue. Do I want to go back to England? Do I? Do I want to go and live in Scotland? That's a bit more attractive. Help the Scottish get independence. Do I want to go and live in Canada, where I'm also a Canadian citizen? Again, I would, but I feel I sort of ought to finish off the peacemaking in Europe and Britain that I'm involved with. And I'm still peace druid of Europe, and I feel I have a duty before I can go home to the New World. I've had lives in the New World, but I'm not sure that, I have finished completely with the peace work here in Europe. Anyway, there's a list of some of the things I don't know, and I'm sure you can all add your own list. It's a big list, right? But let's hope it's creative. Because I think by not knowing, by approaching things from what we don't know, it spurs us to knowledge. So that leads me to my next point. What I've been working on in the last week on my religious mathematics book. Again, the reason I'm developing this concept of religious mathematics is because I don't know about it. I was never taught that mathematics had a religious component in my maths education, and I was never taught that religion had a mathematical component in my religious studies education. And I'm therefore saying, no, hang on, let's put these things together and see what we find. And it's a really useful lens for studying both mathematics and religion, actually. And so this week I've been working on some very interesting fields.